Jump right in. All right, this is Brian Johnson, staff writer for Finance and Commerce, and I'm pleased to be joined by Jordan Milman, CEO and chairman of Archer Datacenters, a developer and operator of sustainable AI-ready data centers in emerging U.S. markets. Archer Data Centers is currently active in Minnesota, where it's proposing a 500,000 square foot data center development on an 84-acre site south of 150th Street and east of Acorn Trail in Faribault. We certainly want to talk about that project, but before we jump into that, Jordan, just want to say thank you for joining me and how you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. And I wonder if I just gave a very brief intro there. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about your company, what exactly you do, and how long you've been in business, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. My career started and was for many years in finance, and I was a bond trader for many years, and then co-founded a hedge fund called LibreMax Capital in 2010, and we invested across the structured product spectrum, and ended up with a commercial real estate mandate that grew to include direct lending, transitional lending, and construction finance. And about a decade ago, we started looking at an asset class that people didn't know a lot about, which was data centers, which is sort of hard to believe now, but it was a really nascent asset class, and wasn't the household concept that it is today. I'll put it that way. And
Hmm.
I was running the portfolio. I was head of trading was my title, but I was effectively responsible for approving investments, and so it meant I had to get really smart on the data center space because we were seeing a lot of opportunity in funding some of those developments. And in doing so, I got very, very excited about the growth potential, both from a demand perspective and a geography perspective. And at the time, in the legacy data center infrastructure in the US kind of mimicked the internet infrastructure. There was sort of 5 to 7 major market nodes and a hub and spoke model that sort of grew from that. And at the time, the concepts that were driving the future of demand were things like autonomous driving and Internet of Things. And we would use AI as sort of a catch-all term, but we certainly didn't appreciate what it would become, and where it is today, and certainly how quickly that would develop. But the bottom line is that there was a thesis around more compute closer to the end user to accommodate all these kind of low latency deployment. And my thought was that before that happened, there was likely to be a number of regional markets that would start to develop as a sort of stepping stone towards the true edge, where there's really a lot of data centers everywhere. And I felt so strongly about this concept that I left the hedge fund that I co-founded. I started Archer Data Centers to expressly develop wholesale colocation, namely facilities in such regional markets, um, such that eventually they could expand towards, again, that true edge. The other concept that was very important to me was the idea of sustainability. And for data centers at the time, that really meant how they were powered mostly. And the hyperscale users, the big hyperscale users were, mostly at that time it was the cloud services providers, had their own internal missions and mandates around sustainability. And they were pretty vocal about wanting to transition to more sustainable sources of power and other sustainability initiatives. But beyond that, there wasn't much talk about it. I would attend data center conferences and I'd go to the sustainability panel and they would be empty. No one really cared. And I thought that that was likely to change. And so I conducted a nationwide study looking for markets that kind of fit the bill to really hit a number of, major kind of, metrics for us. One was the potential for in-market organic enterprise demand that was likely to shift from on-premises data centers to a hybrid model between the cloud and colocation. Reason being, companies that operated their own data centers generally had built them in the sort of last wave of development over the prior decade. They tended to be large and inefficient, and it really was an inefficient model for companies that are not in the IT services business to be running an IT services business. And so we thought that they would likely to migrate to the cloud, which was just starting to really accelerate its demand, as well as have some of their deployments in private colocation for a variety of reasons, from security to privacy to regulatory reasons. And so there were a number of markets that fit the bill, but Nashville was the one that stood out to us for having, limited supply, really interesting potential demand in market, particularly from industries like healthcare and financial services that were growing in that market. Um, and we also found in TVA, the largest public utility in the country, a very helpful partner for things like site selection and economic development initiatives, as well as helping us structure a renewable investment agreement that allowed us to have additionality, new to the world solar power on the TVA's grid, not necessarily on site or even in our state. But it was on the TVA's grid that would allow us to sort of offset our commensurate demand with renewable energy. And shortening the story a bit, we started building right ahead of the pandemic and ran headlong into that, and came out of the pandemic realizing that the demand forces had only been pulled forward in terms of cloud services and content streaming and so forth. And that Nashville had become, amongst another number of other sort of nascent markets, a hyperscale destination. And so we realized that we needed institutional capital to help scale our site. We entered into a joint venture with the developer operator to do so. And that sort of was the sort of our entrance into the data center development market. The reasoning behind our Minneapolis project was largely similar. Obviously, we're several years hence, and the AI dynamics have kind of started to become the most important demand driver. But Minneapolis represents a market in many ways that Nashville did several years ago. It's geographically well situated. The climate is advantageous for a data center. The demand from an enterprise perspective is robust, and it's also becoming, or had been becoming, one of the hyperscale destinations in the regional, kind of Midwest to sort of mid Northwest. And so we spent a year and a half looking for sites that had the sort of land and infrastructure characteristics that we were looking for, and that had power availability. And we ended up in Faribault because of its really friendly and welcoming economic development group, and a municipality that we felt was really a perfect spot for development. We are in a burgeoning industrial corridor, not near any residential area and major residential areas. And we've been working closely both with the city as well as our cooperative partners in Steel Waseca and Great River Energy to bring a modest data center site that we think is well suited to that. To our land as well as the community itself. And so we don't consider ourselves a major hyperscale facility. Our maximum power deployment at this time is 120 megawatts. As you mentioned, we had 500,000 square feet approximately designed, but that's kind of our max footprint. And in many ways, it's likely to be smaller than that.
Hmm.
And so that's where we are now. Maybe I'll pause there. I've been talking for a while.
Excellent. Well, that's a good opportunity to jump in, talk about the Faribault project. As you know, there was a lawsuit that challenged the city of Faribault's environmental review of the project, in essence, and that sort of was a bump in the road. But I was wondering if you could tell us where things stand now and what the next steps are for that project.
Yeah, look, I mean, one of the major priorities that we have, and I think something that hopefully sets us apart from others, is that we understand that there's consternation about a number of things, but one of the main ones is kind of secrecy and confidentiality. And we wanted to be as forthright as possible in terms of what we had planned, what was the potential for the site. And so we conducted an EAW at what I would consider a very preliminary stage. And as such, because we didn't have a final design, we didn't have a signed off taker. We were effectively developing on a sort of speculative basis to the extent that we were. And so the decision, which I think is a reasonable one, is effectively that the design was too preliminary. There's too much uncertainty in the data that we provided because we effectively gave ranges. We said we may use this cooling technology, we may use that cooling technology. Here are the ranges of potential water usage for those. Our power availability or our power usage is going to be likely commensurate with that 120 megawatts of total potential utility power. And so we gave numbers associated with that. But the decision was such that the city has been remanded to get more information so they can make a decision about an EIS at a later stage when there's more concrete information. And we totally understand that. And we're going to work closely with the city to provide that. Getting to that point is effectively getting ourselves to a place where we have a final design, where we know how much backup generation we're going to use and the technology we'll be using, where we know what our cooling mechanism is going to be, so we know how much water usage there will be. And then the city can make an informed decision about how they want to move the path forward. And so, it was a minor bump in the road in that, we thought we would get ourselves out there. Early and sort of present what was possible. But again, I think it was a totally reasonable decision, and we'll abide by it.
Tell us a little bit about how this project would benefit the community. There's been a lot of talk about you know what all the concerns are, right? The consternation about impacts on electrical grid, water supply, etc. I don't know if you want to address that, but also talk about some of the benefits
Sure.
of this project.
Look, I mean, we had a public comment period, and I personally responded to every single person that sent a comment in that period. And what I heard was a lot of well-informed, thoughtful residents who are concerned about data centers, but more so are concerned about what data centers represent and AI in particular. And I think the concerns about AI are largely warranted. I think the concerns about data centers are certainly, understandable, but in some ways misguided. There's a lot of concern about resources, and let's just talk about water in particular. Now, data center cooling technology has evolved and is evolving rapidly. Traditionally, evaporative cooling techniques were used that use a significant amount of water. As the AI deployments, not just AI, just data center deployments in general have become more dense because they use more power per square foot effectively. They have adopted cooling technologies that are way more efficient from a water perspective. What we're talking about mostly is closed loop liquid cooling technologies that really on a sort of ongoing basis use very little water. And there are different cooling technologies, and we're still not certain which one we're going to end up with, but it is likely that we'll end up with something that is more efficient than has been used historically, which has been a lot of the concern from residents and organizations and so forth. From a power perspective, the reason we came to this site was because we had earmarked 120 megawatts of power generated through the Great River Energy network and served by Steel Waseca. The cost for the power infrastructure to bring that power to our site and extend from existing substations will be borne by us. And so the community will not participate in subsidizing that in any kind of direct way from the power infrastructure perspective. And so we are going to be investing a significant amount to bring that power to our site, which will likely benefit others over time. There will be a significant number of jobs created from a construction perspective. Now, those aren't obviously permanent jobs, but it will be a significant project from that perspective. And there will be a number of permanent jobs from security and operations. Furthermore, we have already been working with and have established relationships with a number of local businesses and companies that are involved in the broader infrastructure and digital infrastructure ecosystem that we would love to continue to work with and kind of add value that way. And last but not least, the total value of the data center, if built out to full scale, is well over $1 billion. And so we would be adding a significant amount to the tax base that I have seen kind of case studies in other municipalities where it adds significant value to the community. And so my whole perspective with building is that we're not like completely separate from the community. We're becoming part of the community. And so we're not trying to like impose our will and just plop down a big scary building in the middle of a community that is been operating a certain way for a number of years. We want to be part of it. We want to be part of the solution. We don't want to be an adversary. We want to be an ally. And that's why I've made myself available and will continue to make myself available to every stakeholder that's interested and wants to know what's happening. Now, obviously, we're not going to be able to satisfy everyone, but we do believe that we're building something that is appropriate for this community, is appropriate for our site, is not going to be a strain, an undue strain on resources or capital, and hopefully eventually will really be contributing to the local and regional economy.
When you touched on this a little bit, but how do you make these projects more sustainable?
Well, look, I mean, there are a number of potential factors, which are really hard to be too specific about in the short run because we don't exactly know what the design is going to look like and we don't exactly know who our customer is going to be. And we are triangulating around a type of customer that we think we're going to end up with. But there are things that we can do from, building materials to, again, less water intensive cooling mechanisms. And over time, the market is evolving in a number of ways towards more sustainable practices. And there may be opportunities for alternative fuel usage and backup generations. And there's a lot of different ways that this can go. It's just hard to get too specific too early on. And we understand that over time this is going to be a big topic of conversation, and we're going to continue to participate in it. But we would like to go through the process as it has been laid out for us in terms of the permitting and the entitlements and addressing a lot of these issues through the proper, channels.
And getting back to the environmental review process, one comment I heard from the Minnesota Council of Environmental Advocacy is that maybe an EIS is the appropriate way to go for hyperscale projects. I don't know if that necessarily would apply to your project, but what do you make of that? And is that how would that impact how these projects are developed?
Yeah, I mean, look, there are specific statutory thresholds for requiring an EIS, and those exist for a reason. And my thought is that if you're not meeting those thresholds, you shouldn't necessarily be required, to undergo something that would significantly delay a project, because it almost feels like the rules are attempting to be changed on the fly specific for data centers. And I understand where people are coming from and they want this sort of additional review and so forth. And I think if it's warranted, then everybody who meets those thresholds should undertake an EIS or whatever, kind of regulatory process is necessary. I think where I think I have some issue is in the sort of treating data centers as differently than other industrial projects. If there was no data center on the site, to the extent that it's not going to be farmed anymore, we're in an industrial zone. So if we end up with another processing plant or manufacturing facility that could potentially use way more water and produce much more waste than we would have, then I don't really understand why that wouldn't be taken into account and why data centers should be treated differently. Now, obviously, data centers are a relatively new property type, and there's a lot of unknowns with respect to how they're built and the waste and noise that they produce. But there are channels to sort of address all those things. And at the state level, there has been legislation recently over last summer that specifically delineated, what a large scale data center is and what the requirements are for those data centers from a disclosure and reporting standpoint. And I think that that's warranted. And I think that, we are certainly happy to go through any processes that are deemed necessary by statutory requirements. And the only issue I have is when it comes to sort of what seems to be delay for delay's sake. And for a small business like us, that can be quite painful. We are not some big nameless, faceless corporation, with a ton of resources. We're a business run by myself that found a community in which we felt that we fit very well and were welcomed in by economic development and other municipal groups and said, hey, look, this is the right project at the right time for this market. And, to have undue delays for reasons that don't achieve anything. For instance, like if we had to do an EIS at this stage, it wouldn't elucidate any of the sort of uncertain design elements that haven't been finalized. It would just add, time and cost. And so, I respect everybody who wants to understand more and certainly is entitled to, but I don't think that delay for delay's sake is really kind of the answer, is how I'll put it.
Well, I appreciate that, and I want to be respectful of your time. You've certainly covered a lot of ground here, Jordan, but I want to also give you the last word. Any final thoughts before I let you go?
Yeah, I guess the one thing, last thing I'd want to mention is that, I think there's, and this is not specific to Faribault or Minneapolis or Minnesota. This is something that's happening in all over the country and the world, really, is that, AI is a very new technology, and, people deserve to understand how it's going to impact their lives. And I think AI regulation, we're sort of way behind the curve on that. And there was a very interesting essay written by Dario Amodei, who's the CEO of Anthropic, about his perspectives, as an AI creator, developer. He's asking to be regulated. He sees the value of AI in terms of things like medicine and drug development, and how having a lack of a regulatory regime can actually impede its usefulness to society. And I think that that's a really interesting perspective, because asking to be regulated isn't exactly the obvious choice for someone who's building a massive AI business. And so I think that people who are concerned with AI should really be looking towards the federal, if not state level regulatory regimes, to say, let's talk about what this means. Let's talk about how this is utilized in society. I think the reason that data centers are getting a lot of the attention is that it's a tangible thing. There's a building in your backyard that in which there's a lot of computer servers and a lot of compute is happening. But in those computer servers, it's not just AI training. It's not even necessarily AI inference or sort of everyday AI use. We may have financial services customers. We may even have healthcare customers. We may have, a bank or some other type of business that, they may be deploying their own AI, models within our data center, but it's not necessarily all part of the same, but monolith of AI. And data centers in particular serve a lot of different use cases, not to mention, cloud services and the things that people use on their phones every single day. And so I do think that people benefit from what happens inside of a data center, even if some of the sort of massive facilities can be somewhat scary. And I think that the, consternation about what they mean for the environment and what they mean for a community is warranted. So, the last thing I want to say is that, I am available, and I've made myself available, and I will continue to be. And, as our customer base becomes clear and as our design becomes finalized, we will be disclosing as much as we can to keep the public informed, and they do have a right to know. And whatever, regulatory, steps that we need to take and disclosure steps that we need to take, we will obviously do so and welcome that process. And, we just want to be a productive member of the business community in Faribault and greater Minneapolis.
Well, thank you, Jordan. I appreciate that. I appreciate your transparency and making yourself available to talk about your project and sharing details and things of that nature. And so, good luck moving forward. I hope we can stay in touch. And I know you're in New York. Congrats on the Knicks victory. My son and I watched the game, and we were cheering the Knicks on, so we didn't want to see the Spurs get in after what they did to our team. So.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's fair. And I'm a Knicks fan that going back to the 90s, and so I think I suffered enough.
Nice.
We, felt entitled to this this victory, but it was a fun ride, and yeah, we're happy to be
Yeah.
back. But yeah, listen, I really
Yeah.
appreciate the opportunity to be on your podcast and give my 2 cents, and yeah, happy to stay in touch.
Sounds good. Thank you, Jordan.
All
Have a
right,
good
take care.
day.
Bye.
Take care.